Wyoming Territory, 1873. The wind was the first and last master of this land. It came down from the sharp, unforgiving peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, a relentless sculptor of stone and spirit. It scoured the plains, bent the sparse pines into postures of permanent deference, and carried the scent of dust and distance. For Elias Thorne, the wind was a constant companion, a voice in the profound silence of his life. He stood on the rise, overlooking his ranch, the Double T, his hands resting on the rough-hewn cedar post of a fence line he had just repaired. The wood was solid beneath his calloused palms, a small, tangible victory against the slow entropy of the wilderness. His world was one of such victories: a mended fence, a healthy herd, a roof that held against the snow. It was a life built of practicalities, a fortress of solitude constructed brick by painful brick. He was 32 years old, but the geography of his face was that of an older man. Lines etched by sun and sorrow radiated from the corners of his pale blue eyes, eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. He had come to this valley 8 years prior, full of a hope so bright it felt foolish in retrospect. He had brought a wife, Sarah, whose laughter was like water in a dry land, and a son, Daniel, whose small hand in his was the only anchor he had ever needed. The fever had taken them both in the space of a single winter week, leaving behind a silence so absolute it had its own sound, a high, thin ringing in his ears. He had buried them on the hill behind the house, beneath a lone, stoic cottonwood tree. And with them, he had buried the man he used to be, the man who believed in connection, in the shared warmth of a life lived for someone other than oneself. He had learned the frontier's cruelest lesson: what you love can be taken, and the only way to never lose again is to never have. His days fell into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. He rose before the sun, his movements economical and precise. He worked until the sky bruised with twilight, his labor a bulwark against the tide of memory. His only regular human contact was with Martha, the widow of his former ranch hand, who came up from town twice a week to manage the house. She was a stern, kind woman with eyes that saw more than he was comfortable with, but she rarely spoke of it. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended his clothes, and she filled the quiet corners of the house with the scent of baking bread and lye soap, faint echoes of a life that was no longer his. He was not unkind, but he was distant, a man observing his own existence from a great height. He had learned that survival, true survival, was a solitary pursuit. Attachments were liabilities, emotions a treacherous terrain he refused to navigate again. It was then that he heard it, a sound that always felt like an intrusion from another world. The distant, mournful whistle of the Tuesday train, its cry echoing and fading in the vast emptiness of the valley. It was the territory's iron artery, pumping new people and new problems into the raw, untamed land. Elias rarely went to meet it. The station in Redemption Gulch, the dusty collection of clapboard buildings that passed for a town, was a place he visited only when necessity demanded, for salt, for flour, for cartridges. But today the sound snagged on something inside him, a faint, unfamiliar curiosity. He finished securing the wire, his movements sure and practiced, and turned his horse, Ajax, back toward the ranch house. The whistle blew again, closer this time, a harbinger of a disruption he could not yet name. Clara Abernathy stepped down from the train car, her hand gripping the hot iron rail for balance. The hem of her navy blue traveling suit, so practical and sturdy in the bustling stations of Philadelphia, was already filmed with a fine layer of ochre dust. She felt the sun, a dry and penetrating heat unlike the humid warmth of the east, press down on her. The air was thin, smelling of sage and something else, something wild and clean. Before her lay Redemption Gulch, a single, wide street flanked by unpainted wooden buildings that seemed to squint in the relentless glare. Dust devils like golden phantoms swirled and danced in the road. It was starker, rougher, and more profoundly empty than she had ever imagined. A flicker of apprehension went through her, but she pushed it down, replacing it with the determined hope that had carried her 2,000 miles across a continent. She was 26, a widow, and an orphan. The death of her husband, a gentle professor of antiquities, a year ago had been followed swiftly by the loss of her parents to influenza. She was adrift, and the letter from her late husband's cousin, Mr. Davies, had been a lifeline. He wrote of his thriving mercantile business, his motherless children, and his desperate need for a governess. He had enclosed a ticket and a promise of a new life, a purpose. She scanned the small cluster of men on the wooden platform, searching for a face that matched the kind, fatherly one she had pictured. No one stepped forward. No one seemed to be waiting for anyone at all. The station master, a grizzled man with a tobacco-stained beard, stomped over to her trunks. "That all, ma'am?" he grunted, not unkindly. "Yes, thank you," she said, her voice clear and cultured, a stark contrast to the rough sounds of the platform. "I'm looking for Mr. Alistair Davies. I believe he was to meet me." The man, Jed, paused and squinted at her. "Davies? Ain't no Davies in Redemption Gulch. Never has been." The words struck her with physical force. "That cannot be. He wrote to me. He has a mercantile, children." Her voice trailed off as she saw the certainty in his weathered face. The hope that had been her fuel for weeks sputtered and died, leaving a cold, hollow dread in its place. The wind, which had seemed invigorating moments before, now felt predatory. It whipped at her bonnet and tugged at a loose strap on her valise. The bag tipped, its clasp giving way, and a small collection of personal items, a book of poetry, a silver-backed brush, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, spilled onto the dusty planks. Mortified and overwhelmed, Clara knelt to gather her things. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore across the platform, catching her skirts and pushing her off balance. She gave a small cry, stumbling backward, her arms flailing for something that was not there. She expected to hit the hard, unforgiving wood. Instead, she fell into something solid and warm. Strong hands clamped around her upper arms, steadying her with an effortless strength. The world, which had been tilting precariously, righted itself. She found herself pressed against a hard chest, her face just inches from a faded blue-work shirt that smelled of sun, clean earth, and something uniquely masculine, like leather and pine. Elias had seen the woman the moment she stepped off the train. She was a splash of deep blue against a canvas of brown and beige, as out of place as a porcelain teacup in a blacksmith shop. He had registered her fine clothes, her honey-blonde hair pinned in a neat chignon, and the exhausted hope in her posture. He had overheard her exchange with Jed, had seen that hope shatter like glass against stone. He had felt an unwelcome and inconvenient stirring of something he had long since buried. It was not pity, precisely, but a grim recognition of her vulnerability. He had started to turn away, to retreat to the safety of his solitude, when the wind had intervened. He moved without thinking, his body reacting with an instinct he thought was dead, closing the distance in 2 long strides to catch her before she fell. The contact was a jolt to his system. She was light in his arms, yet her presence was substantial, real. He felt the frantic beat of her heart against his chest and caught the faint scent of lavender, a fragrance from a world he had forgotten. For a long, suspended moment, he just held her, the noise of the station fading into a dull hum. He felt the fragility of her bones beneath his hands, a feeling that dredged up a ghost of a memory. Holding Sarah, her body racked with fever, her life slipping away like fine sand through his fingers. He stiffened, the memory a cold shock of water. He immediately set her back on her feet, his hands dropping to his sides as if he had been burned. His face, which had softened for a fraction of a second, became a mask of stone. Clara looked up at her rescuer. His face was all harsh angles and sun-browned skin, framed by dark hair that needed cutting. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sky, and in their depths she saw a flicker of something, surprise, pain, a profound loneliness, before it was shuttered away, leaving only a cold, guarded distance. "Thank you," she murmured, her cheeks flushing with color. You were very quick. The wind is treacherous, was all he said, his voice a low baritone, rough with disuse. He took a half-step back, creating a space between them that felt wider than a few feet. Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose badge was the shiniest thing about him, had ambled over, drawn by the small commotion. Everything all right here, miss? Abernathy, Clara supplied, her voice trembling slightly. Clara Abernathy. And no, Sheriff, I'm afraid nothing is all right. It seems I have been the victim of a cruel deception. The sheriff listened with a grim expression as she recounted the story of Mr. Davies's letters. He and Jed exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Ma'am, the sheriff said gently, I'm sorry to say it, but it sounds like someone went to a lot of trouble to get you out here under false pretenses. You have any money? Very little, she admitted, her humiliation complete. Enough for a few nights' lodging, perhaps. I had expected to begin my employment immediately, the sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. The only rooms for rent are at the saloon. They're not suitable for a lady like yourself. The dread in Clara's stomach coiled into a cold, hard knot. She was alone, penniless, and utterly defenseless in a place that felt like the edge of the known world. She looked from the sheriff's pitying face to the station master's gruff concern, and finally, to the tall, silent man who had caught her. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his stance rigid with an internal conflict she could not begin to understand. Elias felt the eyes of the other men on him. He was the only landowner for miles with a proper house, a house with empty rooms that echoed with ghosts. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, mount his horse, and ride away. This was not his problem. He had enough ghosts of his own. He did not need to take on the troubles of a stranger. But then he looked at Clara Abernathy, at the proud, terrified set of her jaw as she fought to maintain her composure, and he saw Sarah again. Not the Sarah of his memory, but the young woman he had first brought to this territory, full of courage and a quiet apprehension of the vast, wild land she had agreed to call home. To leave this woman to the mercy of the saloon's rough patrons felt like a betrayal of that memory, a final failure of a duty he thought had died with his family. The words came out before he could stop them, sounding harsh and reluctant even to his own ears. She can stay at my ranch. He directed his words to the sheriff, avoiding Clara's startled gaze. My housekeeper, Martha, is there. It will be proper enough. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes narrowed. It is temporary. Until you can arrange passage back east, the offer hung in the air, as stark and unexpected as a boulder in the middle of the road. Sheriff Brody looked relieved. Clara looked stunned. Sir, I cannot possibly impose. You do not know me. I know you are in trouble, Elias stated, cutting through her polite protestations. It was a simple fact, and he dealt in facts. Martha will see to you. My wagon is at the general store. Without waiting for another word, he turned and strode away, his long-legged gait eating up the distance, leaving her to stare after him, a maelstrom of confusion, relief, and a strange, unnerving flicker of something else entirely. She had been rescued, but she felt as if she had just been claimed by the very wilderness that had so terrified her moments before. The ride to the Double T Ranch was conducted in a silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness. Clara sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped in her lap, acutely aware of the man beside her. He handled the team of horses with a quiet, confident competence that seemed to be an extension of his very being. He did not speak, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his profile sharp and unyielding against the vast, blue sky. She risked glances at him, studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his large, capable hands held the reins. He was a man made of the same hard, elemental stuff as the land around them. The ranch house, when it came into view, was a surprise. Nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek and sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods, it was a sturdy, two-story structure of dark, weathered timber and fieldstone. It was larger and more permanent than anything she had seen in Redemption Gulch. It spoke of intention, of roots sunk deep into the earth. But as they drew closer, she saw the faint air of neglect. The porch railings were solid, but the paint was peeling. The window boxes held only dry soil. It was a house that was lived in, but not loved. It was a shell, waiting for a life that had departed. Martha was waiting on the porch, a stout woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and an apron tied crisply around her waist. Her face was a study in suspicion as she watched them approach, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Clara. "Elias," she said, her voice devoid of pleasantry. "What is this?" Elias brought the wagon to a halt and set the brake. "This is Mrs. Abernathy," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She has been stranded. She will be staying here for a time. See that she has the east guest room." He swung down from the wagon and began unhitching the horses, his movements indicating the conversation was over. Martha's gaze shifted to Clara, sharp and assessing. Clara met it directly, lifting her chin. "It is a great imposition, I know," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I am grateful for Mr. Thorne's charity. I will not be a burden." The older woman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She saw not an adventuress, but a well-bred young woman in genuine distress. "Humph. Charity is one word for it. Stubbornness is another," she muttered, more to herself than to Clara. "Well, come along, child. Let's get you settled before you collapse from the heat." The house was cool and dark inside, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was sparsely furnished, but immaculately clean. The silence within its walls was as profound as the silence outside. The east guest room was simple, containing a bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a small wardrobe. It was also achingly empty. As Martha left her to freshen up, Clara walked to the window. It overlooked a small, fenced-off plot of land on a hill behind the house. Two simple wooden crosses stood beneath a cottonwood tree, their stark shapes a silent testament to the source of the home's deep sorrow. A chill went through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She now understood that she had not just entered a stranger's house. She had stepped into the heart of his grief. Dinner was a quiet affair. Elias sat at the head of the long wooden table, Clara to his right, and Martha, after serving the meal of beef stew and fresh bread, took a seat at the far end. The clinking of cutlery was loud in the stillness. Clara, determined not to be seen as a helpless waif, tried to start a conversation. "Your ranch is beautiful, Mr. Thorne," she began. "You must have worked very hard to build it." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "It is functional," he replied, his tone discouraging further comment. It was Martha who broke the tension. "He built it with his own two hands," she said, her sharp gaze on Elias. "Built it for his Sarah. She drew up the plans herself. Wanted a big kitchen window to watch the sun rise over the valley," the name hung in the air. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but Clara saw the flicker of pain in his eyes again, raw and unguarded. She felt a pang of sympathy, so sharp it was almost a physical ache. She knew that kind of loss, the way a name could become a wound. Later that evening, as Clara sat by the hearth, mending a tear in her traveling dress, Elias entered the room to add a log to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a pocket of warmth and intimacy in the vast, dark house. Martha had already retired for the night. They were alone. "You should not have to work," he said, his voice low. "You are a guest." "I prefer to be useful," Clara replied, not looking up from her needlework. "I cannot abide idleness." She paused, then took a breath, deciding to risk the treacherous terrain of his past. "Martha mentioned your wife. Sarah. It is a lovely name." He straightened slowly from the fireplace, his back to her. She thought for a moment he would not reply, that he would leave the room and the wall of silence between them would be rebuilt higher than before. But then he spoke, his voice rough. "She loved this valley, saw beauty where I only saw hardship. My husband, Thomas, was like that," Clara found herself saying, the words coming softly. "He could find history and meaning in a simple shard of pottery. He saw the world as a library full of stories. When he died, it felt as if all the books had burned." Elias turned to face her. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a deep weariness. For the first time, he was not looking at her as a problem to be solved or an intrusion to be managed. He was looking at her as someone who understood. "I had a son," he said, the admission costing him more than a day of hard labor. "Daniel." He was 5-inch. The simple statement was devastating. Clara's needle stilled in her hand. "A son." She had not known. She looked at the two crosses in her mind's eye, one slightly smaller than the other. The grief she had seen in him was not just for a wife, but for a child as well. It was an ocean of loss, deep and cold. "I am so sorry, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her own losses feeling small in comparison. "Elias." He corrected her, the sound of his own name seeming foreign on his tongue. He looked into her eyes, which were shining with unshed tears, not of pity, but of a profound and quiet empathy. In that moment, the space between them was no longer an empty void, but a bridge built of shared sorrow. It was the first true crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. He did not know what to do with the feeling, this fragile connection, so he did the only thing he knew. He nodded once, a curt, sharp gesture, and left the room, leaving Clara by the fire. The silence he left behind now filled with a new and complex resonance. In the days that followed, a fragile routine began to form. Clara, true to her word, refused to be idle. She rose early, helping Martha in the kitchen, her deft hands learning the rhythm of kneading dough and churning butter. She discovered a neglected vegetable garden behind the house and set about weeding and tending it with a fierce determination, coaxing green shoots from the dry soil. She scrubbed floors, mended linens, and filled the house with the scent of baking pies, using the wild berries she found growing by the creek. She was not trying to replace the woman who had come before. She was simply trying to carve out a small space for herself, to earn her keep in the only way she knew how. Elias watched her from a distance. He would see her in the garden, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and her fine dress protected by one of Martha's aprons, and feel a strange tightening in his chest. She worked with a quiet grace and an uncomplaining resilience that chipped away at his preconceived notions of her. He had expected a fragile, helpless creature who would wilt under the harsh sun of the territory. Instead, he found a woman with a spine of steel hidden beneath her gentle manners. She did not complain. She did not weep. She simply did what needed to be done. He started leaving freshly picked wildflowers on the kitchen table in the mornings, a silent acknowledgement of her efforts. He told himself it was a simple courtesy. It was a lie. Clara, in turn, began to see past the gruff, silent man to the person beneath. She saw the way he was gentle with his horses, his hands sure and kind on the reins. She saw him watching the sunset from the porch, a look of profound melancholy on his face that made her heart ache. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, painstakingly carving a small wooden bird. His large, calloused hands moved with a surprising delicacy and precision. "That is beautiful," she said softly from the doorway. He started, having not heard her approach. He almost concealed the carving, but it was too late. He held it up. It was a simple, elegant shape, the grain of the wood forming a natural pattern of feathers. Something to pass the time, he mumbled, his customary defense. "Who did you make them for?" she asked gently, sensing there was more to the story. His gaze drifted to a dusty shelf high in the rafters. She followed his look and saw a small collection of other animals. A horse, a deer, a bear. They were toys. "My son," he said, his voice thick. "Daniel." He liked birds. The quiet admission was another brick removed from his wall. She walked closer and reached out, her fingers lightly brushing the smooth wood of the bird in his hand. The brief touch of her skin against his was like a spark of lightning. He flinched, pulling his hand back, the bird clattering to the floor. The moment of vulnerability was over, the shutters slamming down in his eyes. He turned away, busying himself with a piece of tack, his shoulders rigid. Clara retrieved the bird and placed it gently on his workbench. She left the barn without another word, understanding that his grief was a wild, wounded thing, and she had to be careful not to crowd it. Two men rode into Redemption Gulch a week after Clara's arrival. They were the kind of men who lowered the temperature of a room just by entering it. They moved with a predator's lazy confidence, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. They took a table at the saloon, ordered whiskey, and began to ask questions. Their names were Cole and Ames, and they were in the employ of Silas Croft, a cattle baron from the South whose ambition was as vast and empty as the plains he sought to control. Croft wanted the Double T Ranch. More specifically, he wanted the creek that ran through it, a source of water that never ran dry, even in the hottest summers. He had tried to buy Elias out, but Elias had refused. Croft was not a man who took no for an answer. He had learned of Elias's tragic past and had devised a cruel, intricate plan. The letters to Clara Abernathy had been his doing, a scheme to introduce a vulnerability, a scandal, a distraction that would weaken Elias's resolve or drive him off his land. The plan had been predicated on the assumption that a refined Eastern woman would be a helpless burden, a source of chaos. Cole and Ames had been sent to observe and, if necessary, escalate the situation. When they learned that Clara was not only present, but seemingly thriving under Elias's protection, their mission changed. She was no longer a potential distraction. She was now a target. Their first move was subtle. Clara had ridden into town with Martha for supplies. As she was leaving the general store, her arms full of parcels, Cole stepped in her path, his smile oily and unpleasant. "Well now, what have we here?" he drawled, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "A pretty little canary, far from her gilded cage." "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice cold as she tried to step around him. He blocked her way again. "No need to be in such a hurry. A lady like you must get awfully lonely out at the Thorn place. A man like him, he ain't much for conversation. My life is no concern of yours," she said, her heart beginning to pound. "I could be your concern," he purred, reaching out as if to touch her arm. Before his fingers could make contact, a hand shot out and clamped around his wrist like a steel trap. Elias stood there, having ridden into town after them, a premonition he could not explain driving him. His face was thunderous, his winter sky eyes frozen into chips of ice. "She said," he began, his voice a low, dangerous growl. To excuse her, he tightened his grip, and Cole winced, his bravado vanishing. "Just being friendly," Cole grunted, trying to pull his arm free. "You are done being friendly," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower. He released Cole's wrist with a shove that sent the man stumbling backward. Ames, who had been watching from across the street, tensed but made no move. Elias's gaze swept over both of them, a silent promise of violence. He then turned to Clara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he took her parcels from her. "Let's go home," he said. It was the first time he had called the ranch that in her presence. The incident shattered the peaceful routine they had established. The threat was no longer a vague shadow. It had a face and a name. Elias became a vigilant protector, his rifle never far from his side. He forbade Clara from going to town alone, a command that chafed at her independent spirit, but which she understood was necessary. The tension in the house grew, a palpable thing that crackled in the air between them. The danger had pushed them closer together, forcing them into a partnership born of necessity. The escalation came a few nights later. A storm was brewing, the sky a bruised purple and the wind howling like a banshee. Elias was on the porch, watching the approaching weather, when he saw it, a flicker of orange light in the direction of his north pasture. It was too bright for a lantern. It was fire. Someone was trying to burn him out, to destroy his winter hay stores. "Stay inside. Bar the door," he ordered Clara, grabbing his rifle from its rack by the door. "You cannot go alone," she protested, her eyes wide with fear for him. "I have to. Lock the door behind me." His command was absolute. He was out the door and on his horse in a flash, disappearing into the gathering dark. Clara did as he said, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The wind battered the windows, and every creak of the old house sounded like an intruder. She paced the floor, her fear for Elias a living thing inside her. She was not the sort of woman to wait helplessly. She went to the fireplace and pulled out the heavy iron poker, its weight a small comfort in her hands. She would not be a victim. The fire was a diversion. As Elias raced toward the flames, Cole and Ames circled around, approaching the ranch house from the rear, their faces grim in the flashes of lightning. They had seen Elias ride out. They believed the woman was alone, an easy target. Their plan was to terrify her, to abduct her, to create a situation so untenable that Elias would have no choice but to cede his land to Croft to get her back. They broke a window in the kitchen, the sound of shattering glass lost in a clap of thunder. Clara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She heard them climb inside, their boots crunching on the broken glass. They were whispering, their voices rough and menacing. She flattened herself against the wall in the dark hallway, the iron poker held tight in her two hands, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was terrified, but a cold, clear rage burned through the fear. These men had brought her here, had threatened her, and now they had invaded this home, this place of quiet sorrow that she had come to care for. Elias reached the fire and realized his mistake. It was small, deliberately set, designed to draw him away. A cold dread washed over him. Clara. He wheeled Ajax around, digging his heels into the horse's flanks, racing back toward the house, his mind a maelstrom of terror and fury. He had left her alone. He had let his guard down. He prayed to a God he had long since abandoned that he would not be too late. The light he saw in the kitchen window was not the warm glow of a lantern. It was the unsteady, moving light of a lamp being carried. They were inside. He dismounted before the horse had even come to a full stop, his rifle in his hands. He moved with a deadly silence, a shadow against the storm-swept night. He slipped around to the front of the house, testing the door. Locked. He moved to a side window, peering into the main room. It was empty. The light was coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. He could hear their voices now, low and taunting. "Come on out, little bird." Cole's voice floated from the darkness. "We just want to talk." Ames laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your protector ain't here to save you this time." Elias felt a rage so pure and white-hot it burned away all thought. He raised the butt of his rifle and smashed the window pane, the sound exploding through the house. He vaulted through the opening, landing in a crouch, the rifle already at his shoulder. The two men spun around, startled. Ames was holding the lamp, his pistol drawn. Cole stood behind him, a cruel smile on his face. In the flickering light, Elias saw Clara. She was pressed into the corner at the end of the hall, the iron poker held in front of her like a sword. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with defiance. She was not screaming. She was not crying. She was ready to fight. A fierce, protective pride surged through him, momentarily eclipsing his rage. "Get out of my house," Elias said, his voice unervingly calm. "Or what, Thorne?" Cole sneered. "You'll shoot us both before we get a shot off? I think we'll take the lady and be on our way." He took a step toward Clara. It was the opening Elias needed. He fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. He did not aim to kill. He aimed for the lamp in Ames's hand. The bullet struck the metal base, sending the lamp crashing to the floor. It shattered, and the room was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the fleeting, ghostly light of the storm outside. Burning oil splattered across the wooden floorboards, igniting instantly. In the confusion, Elias lunged forward, tackling Ames and sending them both to the floor. Cole, blinded and disoriented, fired his pistol wildly into the darkness. Clara screamed as a bullet splintered the wall just above her head. The fire was spreading, smoke beginning to fill the hallway, thick and acrid. Elias wrestled with Ames, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. Ames went limp, but Cole was recovering, turning toward the sound of the struggle, his pistol raised. He could not see Elias, but he could see Clara's lighter dress, a pale shape against the dark wall in a flash of lightning. He aimed. "Elias!" Clara cried out, a raw sound of warning and terror. At that exact moment, just as Cole's finger tightened on the trigger, Clara acted. She did not cower or freeze. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed off the wall and swung the heavy iron poker with all her might. It connected squarely with Cole's gun arm. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud, followed by a scream of agony. The gun clattered to the floor. The distraction was all Elias needed. He was on his feet in an instant, his body a blur of motion. He slammed into Cole, driving him hard against the wall. The fight was over. Smoke was now billowing through the house, the flames licking up the hallway wall. "We have to get out," Elias yelled, his voice hoarse. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the front door. He kicked the bar loose and shoved the door open, dragging her out into the rain-swept night. He turned back for a moment, saw the unconscious form of Ames and the groaning, clutching shape of Cole. He hesitated, then grabbed a water bucket from the porch and doused the worst of the flames near the doorway, enough to keep the fire from consuming the entire house before he could deal with it. Then he pulled the two men out onto the porch, his movements rough and efficient. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, washing the smoke from the air. Adrenaline gave way to a shuddering exhaustion. Clara leaned against the porch railing, gasping for breath, the iron poker still clutched in her hand. Elias stood over her, his chest heaving, his face grimed with soot. He looked at the two subdued men, then at the smoking doorway of his home, and finally his gaze settled on Clara. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw the fierce courage that had made her swing that poker. She had saved him. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had ridden in to be the rescuer, but in the final, critical moment, she had been his. He reached out and gently took the poker from her nerveless fingers, his hand covering hers. Her skin was cold. The thought of what could have happened, of the bullet that had missed her by inches, of Cole reaching her, of losing her, was a chasm that opened up beneath him. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart did not just crack. They crumbled into dust. The solitude he had mistaken for strength was revealed for what it was, a desolate, empty prison. Living without feeling was not living at all. It was just a long, slow death. And this woman, this quiet, resilient woman from another world, had brought him back to life, whether he had wanted it or not. "Clara," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual defenses. He stepped closer, framing her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping the soot from her cheeks. He looked into her wide, rain-washed eyes, and for the first time, he let her see everything. The fear, the gratitude, the terrifying, overwhelming truth of his feelings. "I was wrong," he whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "I thought a man had to be alone to be strong. I thought this land demanded it. But that a fool's logic," his breath hitched. "A man cannot live alone. I cannot live without you." The confession, so stark and absolute, hung between them in the storm. It was more than a declaration. It was a surrender. It was the death of the man who had buried his heart on the hill and the birth of someone new. He saw the shock, the disbelief, and then the dawning understanding in her eyes. The space between them, once filled with unspoken grief and tension, was now charged with a powerful, undeniable current. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not gentle or tentative, but desperate and affirming, a claim made in the heart of the storm. It was the taste of rain, smoke, and a new beginning. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. The fire had been contained, leaving a blackened, gaping wound in the hallway, but sparing the rest of the house. Sheriff Brody had arrived at first light, alerted by Elias. He looked from the two trussed-up men on the porch to the damage inside, and then to the quiet, resolute couple standing together. He listened to the story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Silas Croft," Brody said, the name tasting like poison. "I knew he was a snake, but I didn't think he'd stoop this low." He kicked Cole's boot, not gently. "You'll testify against him, both of you. In exchange, the judge might go easier on you for arson and attempted murder." The men, broken and defeated, mumbled their ascent. The law, slow as it was, had finally reached Redemption Gulch. After the sheriff had departed with his prisoners, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Martha arrived, took one look at the damage and the expressions on their faces, and set about making a pot of coffee without a single question, her quiet competence a comforting balm. Elias and Clara stood on the porch, surveying the damage. The rising sun cast long shadows across the valley. It was the same view Elias had looked at for years, but today it was different. It was no longer a landscape of his solitude. It was the backdrop to the moment his life had irrevocably changed. He turned to her. She looked tired, her face smudged and pale, but her eyes were clear and steady as she met his gaze. The memory of his confession, of his kiss, was a living presence between them. "Clara," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He took her hands in his. They were small, but they were not weak. "What I said last night, I meant every word. I've been living like a ghost in my own life for a long time. You changed that. You brought light back into this house." He reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It was worn smooth with time, glowing with a soft, warm light. "This was my mother's. She gave it to my father on their wedding day, and he gave it to me for Sarah." He paused, the memory a shadow that no longer had the power to chill him. "It represents a life of partnership, of shared burdens and shared joys. A life I thought was lost to me forever." He looked directly into her eyes, his own vulnerable and completely open. "I know this is sudden. I know I have no right to ask it of you, after everything you have been through. But when I first thought of offering you a home here, I told myself a lie. I told myself I only want a family again, a life to fill these empty rooms. But that was just a frightened man talking. The truth is, I want you, Clara. I want to build a family, a life with you. I love you." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief, of a displaced heart finally finding its harbor. She had come to this harsh land seeking a position, a purpose. She had found something infinitely more precious. She had found a home, not in the timber and stone of the house, but in the heart of this complicated, wounded, and honorable man. "Yes," she whispered, the word a quiet affirmation in the morning air. "Yes, Elias, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her into his arms, holding her not with the desperate strength of the night before, but with a gentle, protective tenderness that spoke of a future, of promises kept, of a love that had risen from the ashes. Their wedding was a week later. It was not a grand affair. The small church in Redemption Gulch had been swept clean, and Martha had filled it with jars of wildflowers. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress she and Martha had sewn from bolts of fabric at the general store. Elias stood at the altar, looking uncomfortable but resolute in a dark suit he had not worn in years. The entire town seemed to be in attendance. The initial gossip and suspicion surrounding Clara's arrival had been burned away by the fire and the truth of Croft's villainy. They saw not a scandal, but a story of survival and courage. They saw two lonely people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. They came bearing gifts: a freshly baked cake from the baker's wife, a hand-stitched quilt from the ladies of the church, offers of help to repair the fire damage at the ranch. The community, which had once seemed so distant and unwelcoming, wrapped its arms around them. As they said their vows, their voices clear and strong in the quiet church, it was not just a commitment between two people, but a promise woven into the fabric of the small, tough frontier town. They were no longer two solitary figures against the wilderness, but a part of something larger, a foundation upon which a new life could be built. 2 years later, the sun was setting over the valley, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. The Double T Ranch was thriving. The herd was larger, the fences were strong, and the house itself seemed to have exhaled a long-held breath. The fire-scarred wall in the hallway had been replaced, the new with smelling of fresh-cut pine. A new wing had been added to the house, its large windows open to the evening breeze. The window boxes that had once been barren were now overflowing with vibrant geraniums, and a climbing rose, planted by Clara, wound its way up the porch railing, its blossoms scenting the air. Clara sat on the porch swing, its gentle rhythm a peaceful counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. She was no longer the weary, apprehensive woman who had stepped off the train. Her face was lightly tanned by the sun, and her hands, though still slender, bore the small calluses of a woman who was not afraid of work. Her honey-blonde hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, a practical style for a busy life. In her arms, she held their son, a beautiful, healthy boy of 1 year, with his father's dark hair and her own determined chin. They had named him Daniel. It had been Elias's suggestion, a tribute not just to the son he had lost, but a testament to the healing power of new life. The screen door creaked open and Elias stepped onto the porch. The years had been kind to him. The harsh lines on his face had softened, replaced by the faint creases of laughter around his eyes. The haunted, guarded look was gone, replaced by a deep, steady calm. He was still a quiet man, but his silence was no longer one of grief. It was one of contentment. He crossed the porch and bent down, his lips brushing Clara's temple before he pressed a gentle kiss to his son's downy head. The boy gurgled happily, reaching a small, chubby hand up to touch his father's face. Elias sat down on the swing beside Clara, the added weight settling them into a comfortable stillness. He wrapped his arm around her and the child, pulling them close. Together, they watched the last sliver of sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. The vast, empty land that had once been the symbol of his isolation was now a shared vista, a kingdom for their small family. "Martha says he has your stubborn streak," Clara murmured, smiling as she adjusted the light blanket around the sleeping boy. "And your courage," Elias replied, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. He looked at his wife, at the incredible woman who had faced down deception, danger, and his own broken spirit, and had conquered them all with her quiet strength and unwavering heart. He looked at the child in her arms, a tangible symbol of their love, a future he had never dared to dream of. The silence in his house, once a ringing void of loss, was now filled with the soft sounds of a baby's breath, the creak of the swing, the steady beat of his wife's heart next to his. "Everything I ever needed," he said softly, his gaze sweeping from the mountains to the faces of his family. "Everything I thought I had lost forever was right here all along. You brought me home, Clara." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. He was right. He had given her a home, a family, a love greater than she had ever known. But she, in turn, had given him back his own. They sat together in the gathering twilight, two souls who had found their anchor in each other, their shared future stretching out before them, as beautiful and boundless as the Wyoming sky.